They let her buy the desert forge for pennies. Something behind the brick hearth changed an entire county. Nora Callum was 31 years old, and she owned exactly 14 cents, a wool coat missing 2 of its buttons, and a grief so fresh it still bled at the edges. The man who had reduced her to this, her late husband's brother, Edmund Callum, had done so with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting years for the opportunity. When Silas died of a fever in the autumn of 1887, Edmund arrived at the homestead outside Yucca Flat, Arizona Territory, with a deed that bore a signature no one could quite explain, and within 6 days, Nora was standing at the edge of the Mojave Road with her coat and her 14 cents and nothing else. She walked 4 miles into the town of Perdition Wells, which was itself a kind of joke the desert had played on the people who settled it, and she found, on the eastern edge of its single main street, an old iron-working forge that had been shuttered for 11 years. The building was sandstone and silence. The man selling it asked for a dime and seemed almost embarrassed to take it. He told her the hearth was cracked and the bellows had rotted, and that nobody in their right mind would buy a dead forge in a dying town. Nora gave him her dime and kept the 4 cents. She had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose, and that, as it turns out, is exactly the kind of freedom that allows a person to find what the frightened and the comfortable never think to look for. Because behind that brick hearth, sealed inside the wall with clay and time and someone's desperate hope, was something that had been waiting 11 years for the right hands. Not just Nora's salvation, the salvation of an entire county. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Callum. If you have ever stood in a place that the world seemed to have forgotten entirely, leave us a word in the comments. We would love to know we are not alone in that feeling. There are women who come into their strength the way a river comes into flood, with noise and warning and a great visible rush of water. And there are women who come into their strength the way the desert itself holds water, quietly, underground, invisible to everyone who does not know where to press their ear against the earth and listen. Nora was the second kind, and she had been that way since she was a girl in the copper-dusted town of Harlan's Creek, New Mexico Territory, where her father, James Aldridge, ran a modest but respected ironworks beside the creek bed that gave the town its name. James Aldridge was not a rich man and never pretended to be one. He was, however, a man of extraordinary precision, and he believed that the quality of a thing made by hand was a direct expression of the character of the person who made it. He said this so often, and demonstrated it so consistently, that Nora absorbed it not as a lesson but as a condition of existence, the way she absorbed the smell of hot iron and coal smoke and the particular sound of the hammer finding true. She began working the bellows at 8 years old, not because her father pressed her into child labor, but because she could not stay away. The forge had a heat and a rhythm that felt to her like a living thing, and she wanted to be close to it, the way other girls wanted to be close to horses, or gardens, or the sound of their mothers singing. By the time she was 12, she could hold the hammer with both hands and strike a billet of iron with a consistency that made her father stop and watch with an expression she would only later understand was pride so large he did not know how to contain it. By 15, she could draw and upset and punch and weld. She could read the color of hot iron the way a sailor reads the color of a sky, with her whole body, with a knowledge that lived in the chest rather than the mind. Her father taught her to keep records too, because he said that a forge without records was just a room full of fire, and that every piece of metal that passed through the shop deserved to be accounted for. He kept a long leather ledger on the shelf beside the coal bucket, and in it he recorded every commission, every material cost, every name of every person who had ever brought him their broken tools or their unformed iron, and what he had made of it, and what it had cost, and what he had charged, and whether the exchange had been fair. He was almost religious about fairness. It was the one subject on which his voice took on a gravity that silenced even the hammer. Nora's mother, Clara, had died when Nora was 10, of the kind of quiet illness that takes people slowly and without drama, and in the years after, the forge became both workshop and home in a way it had not been before, a place where Nora and her father lived out their grief through the making of things, through the honest exchange of heat and effort for form. She grew up knowing how to work, knowing why work mattered, knowing that a thing made well was its own kind of prayer. She grew up knowing that iron does not lie. You cannot charm it or flatter it or bully it into being something it is not. You can only learn its nature and work with it honestly, and then it will give you what you ask. These were not small lessons. These were the kind of lessons that a woman carries like a second skeleton, the invisible framework beneath everything else she does, or says, or decides. She met Silas Callum when she was 23, at a territorial fair in Socorro, where he was buying a new gate hinge, and she was selling them from a table beside her father's wagon. He was a quiet man, careful with money and careless with nothing, and he had a way of listening to people that made them feel, for the duration of the conversation, that they were the only person in the county. They were married within the year. Her father gave her his blessing and his ledger and a set of iron stamps with her initials, because he said a woman ought to carry proof of her work wherever she went. James Aldridge died the following spring, peacefully, in his own bed, with the smell of the forge still in his hair, and Nora mourned him with the same quiet intensity with which she did everything, deeply, privately, and without any expectation that the world would pause to acknowledge it. She and Silas built a life on a homestead 40 miles outside Yucca Flat, and it was not a glamorous life, but it was a real one. Chickens and a kitchen garden and a small stone outbuilding where Nora kept a forge of her own, smaller than her father's but true, and where she made hinges and hooks and pot legs and wheel rims for the surrounding ranches. Silas farmed and she forged, and together they made enough, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. Then the fever came, the way fevers come in the desert, without announcement, without mercy, burning everything in its path. Silas lasted 3 weeks from first symptom to last breath, and in those 3 weeks he was too ill to think clearly about documents or deeds or the legal machinery that would determine what happened to everything they had built together. Nora nursed him through every hour of it, and when he died she sat with his body through the night in the way her people had always sat with the dead, and in the morning she rose and washed her face and thought about what would need to be done. Edmund Callum arrived 4 days later. He was older than Silas by 8 years and had always regarded his younger brother's marriage to a blacksmith's daughter with a particular kind of contempt that he kept polished and ready, like a tool he used regularly. He came with a lawyer from Tucson and a deed that named him co-owner of the homestead property under a territorial partnership agreement that Silas had supposedly signed 3 years prior. Nora had never heard of any such agreement. She said so, clearly and without rising from her chair, and Edmund looked at her with the expression of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the other party to understand it. The lawyer's name was Fitch, and he had the eyes of a man who had long ago made peace with the difference between what was legal and what was right. He explained to Nora, in a tone of condescending patience, that the deed was registered, that the territorial court had already been notified, and that she was welcome to contest it, which would cost money she did not have, before a judge in Tucson, which was 2 days' ride away. She had 6 days to vacate. She spent those 6 days going through every paper in the house, every corner of every drawer, every pocket of every coat Silas had ever owned. She found nothing that contradicted Edmund's deed, and she found nothing that helped her. On the morning of the 6th day, she packed her wool coat and her father's iron stamps and the $4 she had kept in a tin behind the flour sack, and she walked out of the house she had helped build with her own hands without looking back, because she had learned from iron that looking back at a thing you cannot change is just a way of burning yourself on something that is no longer hot. She spent 3 days walking and catching rides on freight wagons before she reached Perdition Wells, and by the time she arrived, she had spent $3.86 on food and a night in a barn, and she had 14 cents left, and she was standing in a town that looked like it had given up on itself somewhere around 1876 and had simply not gotten around to falling down yet. Perdition Wells had once been a supply point for the silver mines in the Coyote Hills to the east, and when the mines played out in the mid-1870s, the town had contracted like a lung losing air, slowly, then all at once. There were perhaps 40 permanent residents in 1887, most of them elderly or stubborn or both. The main street had a general store, a post office that operated 3 days a week, a church with a bell but no minister, and a row of abandoned storefronts that stood like missing teeth in an old man's mouth. At the far eastern end of the street, past the last occupied building, stood the forge. It was a low sandstone structure, maybe 30 feet wide and 20 deep, with a broad doorway that had lost its door and a chimney that rose from the rear wall in a column of old and patient brick. The sign above the doorway had faded to near illegibility, but Nora could make out the ghost of letters that spelled Hargrove Iron Works. The windows were shuttered, and one of the shutters had come loose and hung at an angle like a wing. The ground in front of it was hard-packed caliche, swept clean by years of desert wind. There was something about it, the proportions of it, the way it sat low and solid against the pale sky, that felt to Nora not like ruin, but like rest, like something that had been waiting. The man who sold it to her was named Garfield Potts, and he was 80 years old and had been holding the deed to the property for a decade on behalf of the Hargrove estate, which had no living heirs and no interested parties, and which he had frankly forgotten about until Nora knocked on his door and asked if she could rent the forge building for whatever she could afford. He looked at her 14 cents and looked at the forge and said he would sell it outright for a dime and be glad to be rid of the paperwork. She gave him the dime. He gave her a deed written in pencil on a scrap of ledger paper, which he said was good enough for Perdition Wells, and she believed him, because it was. She spent her first night in the forge with no fire, wrapped in her wool coat, listening to the desert cool around her, and trying not to think about how completely she had arrived at the bottom of everything. The building smelled of old ash and iron rust and something else, something mineral and dry, like the smell of stone that has not seen water in a very long time. She lay on the dirt floor and looked up at the dark ceiling and felt the silence of the place settle over her, and it was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one, and she had always preferred honesty to comfort. In the morning she rose and began to take stock. The bellows were indeed rotted. The leather had cracked and stiffened into something more like ceramic than hide. The anvil was still there, a 200-pound London pattern block that sat in the center of the floor like a small, patient god, and when she ran her hands over it, she found it sound beneath the surface rust. The hearth was the problem. It was a deep brick firebox set into the rear wall, and 2 of the front courses of brick had cracked through. Not structurally dangerous, but not workable either, not without repair. She would need fire clay and new brick, and she would need to earn the money to buy them, and she had 4 cents. She spent that first morning clearing the shop of debris, broken wood, a collapsed shelf, the desiccated body of something that had been a rat. And she was sweeping the floor around the base of the hearth when the broom handle caught on something and stopped. She crouched down and looked. There was a gap in the mortar at the base of the hearth, between the bottom course of brick and the sandstone floor, and it was not a crack. It was a seam, clean and deliberate, about 2 inches high and 12 inches wide. She pressed her fingers against the lowest brick and found that it moved, not much, not freely, but with the particular resistance of something that had been mortared and then freed again by someone who knew what they were doing. She sat back on her heels and looked at the hearth for a long time. Then she went to the doorway and found a flat piece of scrap iron among the rubble outside, and she came back and worked the edge of it into the seam and applied careful, patient pressure, the way her father had taught her to work iron, not with force, but with understanding. The brick shifted, then it slid, then it came free in her hands, and behind it was a darkness, and from the darkness came a smell she recognized immediately and completely: old paper and dry leather, and the particular sweetness of ink that has been sealed away from air for a very long time. She reached into the hollow, and her fingers found a leather satchel, flat and stiff, tied shut with a cord that had dried to the texture of wood. She set it on the anvil block in the thin morning light and untied it with hands that were not entirely steady, and inside she found three things: a folded letter sealed with wax, a small cloth bag that clinked with a weight she did not yet dare to name, and beneath both of these, a ledger, not unlike her father's. Long, leather-covered, dense with columns of figures and names written in a hand so precise and small it looked almost mechanical. She opened the letter first. It was dated September 14th, 1876, and it was addressed to no one specific. "To whoever finds this," it began, and the formality of that opening, so careful and so resigned, made something tighten in Nora's throat. She read it slowly, once, and then again, because the first reading gave her the facts, and the second reading gave her the weight of them. The letter had been written by a man named Calhoun Hargrove, the same Hargrove whose name had faded above the doorway. He had been the blacksmith and ironwright of Perdition Wells for 22 years, and in those years he had also served as the unofficial banker and record keeper for the mining operations in the Coyote Hills, because the nearest actual bank was in Tucson, and the miners and small operators in the hills had needed somewhere closer and more trustworthy to deposit their earnings and record their claims. Hargrove had kept their money in a strong box beneath the forge floor. The letter mentioned this, and he had kept their records in the ledger, and he had done so honestly and carefully, and without charging more than a small fee for the service. He described himself in the letter as a man who understood that a community's wealth was not the sum of its individual holdings, but the degree to which those holdings were accurately known and justly recorded. In the autumn of 1876, when the mines began to play out and the larger operators began to pull out of the Coyote Hills, a land company from back east, he named it the Continental Western Development Corporation, had moved into the territory with lawyers and surveyors and a set of deeds that it claimed superseded the original mining claims filed by the individual operators. The individual operators, many of them illiterate or barely literate, had been unable to contest these claims effectively, and the Continental Western men had used the confusion of the mine closures and the exodus of workers to press their advantage. They had bought up claim after claim for fractions of their actual value, and they had done so using a legal mechanism that depended entirely on the absence of proper records. Because if the original claims could not be precisely documented, they could be disputed, and if they could be disputed, they could be bought for almost nothing from men who were frightened and exhausted and ready to leave. Hargrove had understood what was happening. He had also understood that his ledger, with its precise record of every claim, every deposit, every transaction he had managed for the miners over 22 years, was the one thing that could prove the original ownership and the actual values involved. He had understood that if the Continental Western men knew he had it, they would find a way to take it or destroy it. And so he had done the only thing he could think of to protect it. He had sealed it behind the hearth, with the letter explaining what it was and why it mattered, and the cloth bag containing the last of the deposits that had never been claimed, $43.60 in silver coin, belonging to 7 named miners whose forwarding addresses he had written on a separate sheet, folded inside the ledger cover. He had then left Perdition Wells himself, quickly, under circumstances the letter did not detail, and he had apparently never returned. The letter ended with a single sentence that Nora read 3 times, each time feeling it settle deeper into her. "I leave this to whoever comes after me, in the faith that honest records are not destroyed by time, only by cowardice, and that there will always be someone for whom cowardice is not an option. Nora sat on the anvil block in the desert morning light, with the ledger open across her knees for a very long time. Outside, the wind moved through the empty street of Perdition Wells with a sound like breathing. The silver coins in the cloth bag caught the light through the broken shutter and threw small, quiet sparks across the sandstone floor. She was 31 years old, and she had 14 cents and a dime's worth of property, and in her hands she held 22 years of honest record-keeping that someone had tried to bury, and that had instead been waiting, with the patience of iron, for the right moment to be found. She was not naive. She understood, as she sat there, that what she held was not simple or safe. The Continental Western Development Corporation had been operating in Arizona territory for over a decade. It had lawyers and money and connections to the territorial government in ways that a woman alone in a dead-end forge with 4 cents to her name did not. She understood that the ledger was evidence of fraud on a scale that would make powerful men very uncomfortable, and that powerful men who were made uncomfortable had ways of making the source of their discomfort disappear. She had just watched a man use a fraudulent deed to take her home from her, and that man had done it with a lawyer and a polite tone and the complete confidence of someone who knew that the machinery of the law would not trouble itself on her behalf. But she also understood something else, something she had known since she was 8 years old, working the bellows beside her father. She understood that iron does not lie, and that records are a form of iron. They hold the shape of what actually happened, regardless of what anyone later claims. And she understood that Hargrove had known this too, and had trusted that someone, someday, would come along who knew it. She had the feeling, sitting there in the light and the silence, that she had not stumbled into this place by accident. She had been sent here by the same logic that sends a river toward the lowest point, not by design, but by the nature of things. She had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose, and that, as it turns out, is exactly the kind of freedom that allows a person to do what needs to be done. She began to read the ledger from the beginning. It took her 3 days. Working by daylight and by a stub of candle she traded a piece of scrap iron for at the general store. The general store was run by a woman named Hetty Broom, who was 64 years old and had been in Perdition Wells since 1863, and who looked at Nora with the frank, unsentimental appraisal of someone who has survived long enough to have stopped wasting time on pretense. Hetty had known Calhoun Hargrove. She said so on Nora's second visit, when Nora came to trade another piece of scrap for a handful of cornmeal. She said Hargrove had been the finest man in the county, that he had been driven out by the Continental Western people, and that she had always believed he had left something behind, but had never known where to look. She said this while she was weighing the cornmeal, and she said it in the same tone she might have used to note that it looked like rain. Nora listened and said nothing, and went back to the forge and kept reading. On the 4th day, she walked into the office of the county recorder in Cienega Junction, which was 12 miles north and the nearest thing to a seat of government in that part of the territory. She walked all 12 miles because she had no money for a horse or a wagon. She carried the ledger and the letter in her father's leather satchel, which she had repaired with a strip of rawhide she found in the forge. She was wearing her wool coat with the 2 missing buttons, and her boots had a crack in the left sole that let the desert sand in, and she was aware of how she looked, which is to say, she was aware of how people who looked like her were typically treated in offices where records were kept and decisions were made. She had thought about this on the walk up and had decided that it did not matter, which was not the same as deciding it was not true. It was simply not a factor she could afford to let stop her. The county recorder was a man named Thomas Adair, and he was in his 50s and had the careful, slightly weary manner of a man who had seen enough of the territorial legal system to have lost his illusions about it without losing his belief that it was better than nothing. He looked at Nora across his desk with the practiced neutrality of a man who received all kinds of people in his office and had learned to withhold judgment until he understood what they had brought him. She placed the ledger on his desk and placed the letter beside it and said, quietly and precisely, that she had found them sealed behind the hearth of the Hargrove Ironworks in Perdition Wells, and that she believed they constituted documentary evidence of fraudulent land acquisition by the Continental Western Development Corporation, affecting mineral claims throughout the Coyote Hills district. There was a silence. Adair looked at the ledger. He looked at the letter. He looked at Nora. He picked up the letter and read it, and she watched his face as he read it, and she saw the moment. There was a specific moment, about 2/3 of the way through, when his expression changed from professional neutrality to something older and more serious. He set the letter down and opened the ledger and turned through several pages, slowly, and then he looked up at her and said, in a voice that was very level and very careful, "Where did you say you found this?" She told him again, in the same words, and he listened with the same attention he might give to testimony, which she later understood was exactly what he was doing. He was treating her account as testimony, which meant he was already thinking about what came next. What came next took 4 months. It was not simple or fast, and there were people who tried to stop it. A lawyer from Tucson, representing the Continental Western interests, came to Perdition Wells twice, the first time to speak to Nora and the second time to speak to Adair, and both conversations were, by all accounts, unpleasant for the lawyer. The Territorial Attorney General's office became involved because the fraud documented in Hargrove's ledger crossed county lines and involved enough money to constitute a matter of territorial rather than local jurisdiction. There were hearings in Tucson that Nora attended, wearing a dress that Hetty Broom lent her and carrying her father's iron stamps in her pocket for the feeling of having something solid in her hand. She gave her account clearly and without embellishment, and when the Continental Western lawyers questioned her character and her standing and the circumstances by which she had come to own the forge, she answered every question in the same level, unhurried voice, and she felt, each time, her father standing slightly behind her left shoulder, saying nothing, being there. The outcome was this. The Territorial Court found that Continental Western had acquired 37 separate mineral claims through fraudulent misrepresentation of ownership records between 1876 and 1882. The original claimants, or, in most cases, their surviving families, because 11 years had passed and some of them had died, were identified through Hargrove's ledger and through the records of the Territorial Land Office, which Adair had combed with the thoroughness of a man making up for lost time. Settlements were negotiated. Money changed hands, not all of it, not perfectly, not in the way that pure justice would have demanded, because justice in the territorial courts of 1887 was impure and imperfect and slow. But it was something. It was more than nothing. 7 miners, whose deposits Hargrove had recorded in his last entries, were traced through the forwarding addresses in the ledger cover. 3 were found living. The $43.60 that Nora had carried from the forge to the county recorder's office was returned to them, $2.11 to each surviving man, with a letter from the court acknowledging the original deposit and the interest that would have accrued. This was not a large sum. The men who received it did not become rich, but they wept, each of them, when the letter came, and Hetty Broom, who had helped Nora write the letters to locate them, said that the weeping was not about the money, but about the being remembered, about someone having kept the record, about the fact that their names had been written down in a good man's book and had survived. The town of Perdition Wells itself, and this was the part that Nora had not anticipated, had not planned for, had simply watched happen with the same quiet attention she gave to everything. The town of Perdition Wells began to revive. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the way that a coal fire revives when you clear the ash and give it air. The territorial court proceedings had brought attention to the Coyote Hills district, and the attention had brought surveyors, and the surveyors had found that the hills still held silver, not the bonanza quantities of the 1870s, but a respectable, workable amount that a small operation could extract profitably. 3 of the original claimant families, having received their settlements and their documentation, filed new claims. A mining supply company from Tucson opened a depot in Perdition Wells. 2 new families arrived, then 4. Hetty Broom expanded the general store. The church with the bell found a minister, and Nora fixed the hearth. She did it properly, with good fire clay and sound brick, working methodically through 2 long days, while the October light came through the open doorway and the desert cooled around her. She repaired the bellows with new leather, cut and stitched by her own hands. She cleared the rust from the anvil face with a wet stone and oil, working in slow circles until the iron came up gray and clean and true beneath her hands. She opened the forge for business on a Tuesday morning in November of 1887, and her first commission was a set of door hinges for the new mining supply depot, and she made them well, and she marked each one with her father's iron stamps, the ones with her initials, or rather, the initials he had given her, the ones that were both his and hers, the ones that said the work had come from a particular pair of hands, and that those hands had been honest. As for Edmund Callum, the man who had taken her home with a forged deed and a Tucson lawyer, the territorial proceedings that followed the discovery of Hargrove's ledger had a consequence that no one had specifically planned, but that Nora, when she heard about it, received with the stillness of someone who has learned not to be surprised by the logic of things. Thomas Adair, in the course of his research into fraudulent land transfers in the territory, had examined a number of other deeds that had come before the territorial court in recent years. Among them was a deed to a homestead property 40 miles outside Yucca Flat, transferred under a partnership agreement dated 3 years prior to the death of one Silas Callum. Adair had noted certain irregularities in the notarization of this deed, and had referred the matter to the Territorial Land Office for review. The review found that the notary whose seal appeared on the document had retired from practice in 1883, 4 years before the deed was supposedly witnessed and signed. Edmund Callum was summoned to Tucson. The homestead deed was voided. The property reverted to the estate of Silas Callum, which meant, under territorial inheritance law, that it passed to his widow. Nora received the letter from the Territorial Land Office on a cold December morning, standing in the doorway of the forge with a cup of coffee in her hand and the smell of the fire behind her. She read it twice. Then she put it in the leather satchel with her father's ledger and her iron stamps and the stub of the candle she had read Hargrove's letter by, and she went back inside and stoked the fire and picked up her hammer, and she worked through the morning with the particular quiet concentration of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. She did not go back to the homestead. That surprised some people, and a few asked her about it, and she gave different answers at different times. That the forge suited her better, that she had work in Perdition Wells that was not finished, that she had no particular desire to live in a house that had been stolen from her and given back, because a thing returned by legal process is not quite the same as a thing that was always yours. The truest answer, the one she gave only to Hetty Broom on a winter evening when they were sitting by the stove in the back of the general store drinking tea, was simpler than any of that. She said, "I came to this place with nothing, and what I found here was more than anything I lost." That is not nothing. That is not even close to nothing. She leased the homestead to a family from Texas who needed land and knew how to work it, and she used the income to buy the building next to the forge and expand her operation. Within 2 years, she had 2 apprentices, a 16-year-old boy named Orrin, whose family had come with the mining revival, and a 14-year-old girl named Tessie Broom, Hetty's granddaughter, who had the same inability to stay away from the fire that Nora herself had had at 8 years old. Nora taught them the way her father had taught her, precisely, patiently, with the understanding that the quality of a thing made by hand is a direct expression of the character of the person who made it. She kept a ledger. She recorded every commission, every material, every name, She charged fair prices and kept honest accounts, and marked every piece that left her shop with the iron stamps that bore her initials. Hargrove's ledger she gave to Thomas Adair for safekeeping in the county records. Before she did, she had a local printer in Cienega Junction make a clean copy of it, every page, every figure, every name, and this copy she kept in the satchel with her other documents, because she believed, as Hargrove had believed and as her father had believed before him, that records are not destroyed by time, only by cowardice, and that the work of keeping them honestly was its own form of courage, quiet and daily and necessary and never done. We began this story with a woman of 31 years standing on the eastern edge of a dying street, holding 14 cents and a grief she did not yet know how to carry. We told you she was cast out by a man with a forged deed and a Tucson lawyer, that she walked 4 miles in a coat with 2 missing buttons, that she gave a dime for a dead forge and kept the 4 cents because she had nowhere else to go. We told you that behind the brick hearth of that forge, sealed away with clay and time and one honest man's desperate hope, there was something waiting that would change not just her life, but an entire county's. We did not tell you then what it would cost her to find it, not in money, which she did not have, but in the particular courage of a woman who has lost everything and chooses, anyway, to act as though honesty matters, as though records matter, as though the names of ordinary people written down in a good ledger are worth protecting, as though the work of a single pair of honest hands can hold a shape against the pressure of time and greed and forgetting. We are telling you now that it can, that it did, that Nora Callum, blacksmith's daughter, ironwright, keeper of records, woman of Perdition Wells, Arizona Territory, proved it, not with noise or drama, not with the kind of heroism that gets its own monument in the town square. With a broom handle and a piece of scrap iron and the patience to press against something that resisted until it gave way. With the willingness to walk 12 miles in cracked boots, carrying a dead man's evidence to an office where she had no reason to expect a fair hearing. With the knowledge, her father's knowledge, now hers, that iron does not lie, and that a thing made or recorded honestly will outlast every attempt to bury it. The forge in Perdition Wells still stands, if you know where to look. The chimney is intact. The sandstone walls have the color of the desert at late afternoon, that particular warm, reddish gold that looks like the earth is remembering the sun. Above the doorway, if the light is right, you can still see the ghost of the original sign, Hargrove Iron Works, and below it, in letters that are newer and cut deeper, the name that replaced it, Callum Iron Works, established 1887. And below that, so small you have to lean close to read it, a single line that Nora had her printer set in type, and that she nailed there herself on the day she repaired the hearth and lit the fire for the first time. Records kept honestly outlast every attempt to bury them. We want to thank you for sitting with us through Nora's story today. If this one moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who has been told that what they have is not enough, that where they are is not worth staying, that the thing they are carrying is not worth the weight. And we want to ask you one question before you go, the kind of question worth sitting with. What is something you once overlooked, or that the world once wrote off as worthless, that turned out to hold more value than anyone imagined? Leave your answer in the comments if you feel like it. We read them, every one, and we are grateful for each of them. Until next time, stay close.